Senator Siewert.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. I, of course, rise to support this piece of legislation, and I'm glad I've been speaking a little bit down the speaking list because it gives me an opportunity to respond to some of the claims that have been made from both sides of the chamber. The reason we're having this debate is because the government has not been able, or the industry has not been able to demonstrate that they can deal with the consistent cruelty we see in this trade. Now, last year we had a very substantive debate about export of live cattle, and as a result, and I'll go into some of the details of that in a minute, but as a result of that, changes were made that were supposed to ensure that these sorts of things don't happen again. And yet, playing out just recently, we have seen the extremely cruel and tragic images of those of sheep being subjected to cruelty, and the fact that those sheep have been subjected to that cruelty just shows very clearly that the processes the government has put in place to supposedly ensure that this trade is no longer cruel have simply failed. This bill will put an end to the horrific treatment of Australian livestock that are currently transported overseas and processed in overseas abattoirs. We are the ones that prompted the wide-ranging inquiry into the live exports industry that was carried out by the Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport Committee last year, that did open up the trade to parliamentary scrutiny. Now, there's been a number of claims made during this debate about organisations that held on to images that supposedly planned this attack on the industry. The likes of Animals Australia and RSPCA, those groups, have for years and years been trying to highlight the cruelty of this industry, have looked at the numbers of sheep and cattle that have died on transport as they're being transported overseas, and I'll go into some of those numbers shortly. For years they have taken images that they have managed to get to the ministers on both sides, in fact, both previously under the coalition but also under the ALP. And for years ministers and governments have ignored that image. Of course, organisations like Animals Australia and RSPCA would take those images elsewhere to try and get somebody to pay attention because governments wouldn't and because industry wouldn't. And Senator Scullion says, "Oh, Senator Siewert, you go and explain to the Northern Territory pastoralists, to Aboriginal pastoralists, why the ban was put in place and why you're seeking to change this." Well, I put it back to the industry on this one. Industry had responsibility to make sure that their industry was not cruel and that these measures were put in place, and they simply have not been able to do that. This sort of legislation is needed because there is an ongoing failure by both industry and government to be able to ensure and control welfare and maintain welfare standards. The appalling treatment of animals in Kuwait markets, the stranding and the repeated filming and vision of mistreatment highlights yet again that we are not able to ensure welfare standards. The recent stranding of the 22,000 sheep offshore from Bahrain and then their subsequent treatment in Pakistan are the most recent and graphic examples of the failures of the new Exporter Supply Chain Assurance Scheme, the ESCAS. We, in fact, I understand, still don't know what has happened to the remaining animals. As we know, about half of them were killed in what is reported to be very cruel circumstances. We actually can't find out what's happened to some of those remaining animals. It just shows that we cannot control what happens in other countries. We cannot guarantee that animals are treated humanely and that they're treated cruelty-free and that we're maintaining welfare standards. In other words, the Export Supply Chain Assurance Scheme, we can't trust that it's working. We have to continue to rely on investigations and revelations by animal welfare groups like Animals Australia and RSPCA and investigative journalists to review this cruelty. Their work highlights what is going on. And I get back to my point of it is these organisations that are the organisations that are highlighting it. And if government won't listen, of course organisations are going to go elsewhere to show this footage and to highlight what is going on. And that vision that we saw last year, people had been trying to raise this issue for years and years, to no avail. And I do get extremely frustrated when there's scurrilous attacks made on these organisations that are unfounded, when it's those organisations that have raised awareness and succeeded in getting adequate, or more, not adequate, they're still inadequate, but at least better controls put in place than would have previously been there. And yet it's them that get attacked. If those organisations had not got that footage and shown that footage, those practices would still be happening right now. And we're still seeing cruelty. The Export Supply Chain Assurance Scheme was put in place as a quick fix, aimed at really it was about saving face rather than significantly improving the conditions for Australian animals. We said at the time we had very, very strong concerns. We said at the time that this would not fix the issue, and we expressed very strong concerns, for example, that it didn't include pre-slaughter stunning. The insurance system is based on OIE standards, which are basic standards essentially prepared for developing countries. And with that in mind, they are the minimum basic standards. The OIE guidelines offer significantly less protection than animal welfare standards enforced in Australia. They allow practices that would be illegal in Australia to take place in foreign markets. These guidelines do not require animals to be stunned before slaughter and do not prevent the roping, tripping and casting of animals. Ultimately, the Australian Greens believe that there is no way to implement safeguards that can guarantee the humane transport and slaughter of animals in overseas markets, and we do not believe that the implementation of a traceability system will adequately prevent Australian animals from cruel treatment. And we can see this in the latest debacle that's unfolded before our eyes, where sheep are sent over, claims of disease are made, and then what do? Oh, we'll take them to Pakistan. Oh, we can guarantee the safeguards there, can we? Well, no, we can't. We've seen that. And my office certainly received a huge number of phone calls and emails from people expressing their concern. And I know the export company concerned did, because I've seen, well, I'm relying on media for that, but I've seen media reports where they also received a large number of concerns because they couldn't, and I'm sure they were very frustrated, because they couldn't control what was going on. They couldn't guarantee the sheep under their control were being appropriately treated. We cannot guarantee that. We need to look at how to improve and increase processing in Australia. We should be able to support local producers and jobs. The community benefits of processing meat in Australia have been underestimated for too long and have been talked down by the live export industry. Live exports compete with and undermine Australia's ability to look at domestic processing, both in the beef and sheep markets. This leads to lost processing opportunities in Australia. And Senator Rhiannon, when she was opening the debate on this legislation, referred to some work that's been done by ASIL Tasman on the ability for processing in Australia, or the opportunity to do processing in Australia. And a report in 2009 by ASIL Tasman reported that WA sheep processors estimated that the total number of jobs in meat processing would increase to about 4,000. That's the number of jobs. Sorry, would increase to about 4,000 from the 2,000 then employed in WA, if sheep were processed domestically rather than exported live. Taking into account multiplier effects, it is likely that the increase in employment would in fact be much higher than that. In 2012, ACIL Tasman estimated that construction of an abattoir in Northern Australia, which would provide Northern Australian cattle producers with an alternative market for their cattle and eliminate their reliance on the live cattle trade, would create about 160 to 170 jobs directly and indirectly an estimated 1,300 jobs in the region. And Senator Sterle touched on this issue and said that, oh, well, it was implying, I won't verbal him, was implying that we had rocks in our heads if we thought that that sort of thing was going to happen, and also highlighted the importance of jobs in the Kimberley. And I couldn't agree more with him about the importance of jobs in the Kimberley. But if you look at where the jobs are being generated in Australia, in fact I have done that in the Kimberley. If you look at where the highest employment rates in the Kimberley are, the four biggest industries by employment in the Kimberley are healthcare and social assistance, public administration and safety, education and training, and the retail trade. Followed closely behind retail trade are accommodation, tourism, and food and construction. So food's in there, but lower down where the job opportunities are. My point here is that we should be investing in alternatives to live cattle, and if we did, we would generate more jobs. Why isn't the government looking at what are the tariffs, subsidies, quotas and other distortions of the market in the countries that we export that actually distort the market so it's more favourable to them to import live cattle or sheep rather than the meat trade? What the government needs to be doing is reviewing in the countries that we export to what are those barriers and start discussing with these countries, removing those barriers to the meat trade so that there isn't inappropriate distortions which favour live export rather than the chilled meat trade. Earlier on also, where a lot of the recent debate started, of course, was in the appalling treatment of the cattle that we saw last year, and the debate has heavily focused on that trade to Indonesia. Well, a couple of years ago, as was very quickly touched on, the Indonesians brought a rule in that you could no longer trade for cattle over 350 kilograms because they wanted to take those cattle and fatten them up in Indonesia. Around that time, they also really clearly said that they wanted to move to having their own sustainable. They wanted to be self-sustaining in Indonesia, and they would then base their decisions on live imports or bringing cattle in on that. And of course, this year they've made that announcement, and the industry seems to be shocked by it. We need to be looking at how we can be processing our meat in Australia rather than be shocked every time the Indonesians think about how they make their own trade sustainable. And that's why we believe government needs to be doing more to look at what are the barriers and the barriers to be able to improve our export of, in fact, chilled meat or processed meat, which would generate jobs in Australia rather than exporting those jobs overseas. There is some work that has been done around that, and we need to be doing more. I'd also like to touch on this issue around the grains and agriculture. I find in particular Senator Sterle's comments rather a joke, quite frankly, coming from the Labor side of government, coming from the government, coming from Labor, who don't understand agriculture, don't understand the bush, have wrecked funding, caring for our country funding, moved away from a sustainable approach, moving away from a planning approach, moving away from a landscape scale planning approach and landscape scale repair, have moved away from funding in research that's absolutely critical to agriculture if it's going to move into the future, moved away from funding extension officers, the very things that are going to keep our agriculture into the future sustainable, not adequately addressing those research needs. They are going to be absolutely critical to the future. I'm really, really sick of the arguments that try to denigrate the Greens rather than actually dealing with the issues at heart, and that is a truly sustainable agriculture that is competitive. And we need that research so that our markets are, so that our agriculture is competitive. But it has to be sustainable. It has to have that leading edge. Where's the money for that investment in that research? That has been cut, and I've had a lot of farming organisations in my door talking about the need for improved research, talking about the need to make our agriculture sustainable and competitive. We do actually understand that really clearly. We also understand about generating jobs in Australia and not exporting them overseas, which is what the live trade export does. We believe we need to be processing much more in Australia, and we need to be focusing on how we can support further processing facilities in Australia. As articulated, economic analysis shows how we can improve job prospects in Australia. We can benefit producers if we can do more processing in Australia, and that, of course, will help regional communities. We support the development of these facilities that are sustainable, meet environmental development standards and that are supported by local communities. We believe we need a support across the board for this to happen and for investment to be made in the long-term future of the livestock industry. We believe that we can build up a market that demands high-quality frozen meat, and that Australia needs to be able to step up and meet and help generate that demand and meet that demand. Processing animals in Australia protects them from the inhumane treatment that we will continue to see, because we cannot guarantee that welfare standards are met. We've seen that we cannot rely on the export supply chain assurance scheme. We cannot rely on that. We have seen now that we cannot rely on that. Yes, the government's carrying out an investigation, but they cannot adequately enforce these standards. We need to be moving to ensure that the damage and the loss of the cruelty that happens to these animals doesn't continue to happen. There needs to be a multiple-pronged approach to this, and I accept that the processing market needs a significant investment and that it needs time to develop. But if we don't want to see the continuation of the deaths of 19,000 sheep that died at sea in 2011, or the 1,000 cattle that died in transport, and see the images for those animals that do survive those journeys, then we don't want to see those images splashed across not only Australia but across the world of the cruel and inhumane treatment that occurs to those animals in abattoirs, in some of these abattoirs overseas. The government wanted us to think that when they put this assurance scheme in place, that cruelty would end, that we wouldn't see it anymore. Well, it didn't. It didn't end. It's continued. And nobody can guarantee that it won't, because we cannot ensure enforcement of this system overseas. It's unfortunate, and it distresses me immensely that we can't, that we will see those images again. We don't know, as I said, what happened, what's happened to those sheep that did remain, that were alive just last week. We don't know what's happened to them. This sort of trade cannot continue. We need to be looking at how we can foster a truly sustainable agriculture in this country. That requires thinking outside the box. It requires investment. It requires talking to our trading partners to look at those barriers. We're supposed to be doing that in this country, and our agriculture has suffered for that. Talk to the apple growers. We were talking in this chamber today about pineapples. We need to be doing things differently, and we need to be protecting these animals while growing a sustainable agriculture in this country.
Thank you, Senator Siewert.